If you're sick, stay home. That's what public health experts and co-workers would prefer. But it can be very tough to forego a day's pay to rest up and get better. That's why, in the wake of the coronavirus threat, more than 200 healthcare workers in Ontario recently sent a letter to the government to get paid sick leave, which was scrapped last year, reinstated. Let's get into this with Dr. Kate Heyman, emergency physician and steering committee member at the Decent Work and Health Network. Ryan Wozniak, Senior Vice President of Operations and Legal at the Human Resources Consultancy, Peninsula Canada. Peter Gossman, Vice President of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. And Sarah Yurichuk, Founder and Senior Consultant at Momentum HR. And it's good to have everybody around our table tonight for this discussion, which seems very timely in light of what's going on. Kate, to you first, please. Just tell us a bit about Decent Work and Health Network. What is that?
Yeah, so the Decent Work and Health Network is a group of health professionals, which includes nurses, doctors, public health professionals, and students as well, who are fundamentally concerned about the relationship between work and health. We know that where you work, what you do at work, and workplace policies have a profound impact on people's health, and we think it's really important to emphasize that fact.
And you're the guys who put out this letter with 200 signatories now?
That's correct.
You are. And why are you calling on the government to reinstate paid sick leave?
Yeah, so as you know, there are three main policy changes that we're actually calling on the government to reinstate. So the first one is to reinstate the 2 paid sick days that were taken away from workers. The second is workers previously had 10 days of flexible, unpaid job-protected leave. And that's now being restricted to just 3 days for illness. As health providers, we know that that is just not enough. The third piece is the Ford government has reinstated the requirement for sick notes. And as folks who work in the health system, we recognize that that puts a tremendous burden on our already very stressed system.
You love writing sick notes for people?
I absolutely do not.
I kind of figured. Okay, that's your pitch. Have you heard a response from the government yet?
So we haven't heard the response from the government that we'd been hoping for. But what we have heard from the public is people are really thinking about this right now. People are worried about the impact that not having paid sick days is really going to have on public health, particularly in the midst of flu season with the threat of the coronavirus. This is high on everyone's mind, and we think it's time for the policy to change.
Peter, can I just take you back? Because the Making Ontario Open for Business Act introduced all these changes when the government changed hands a little more than a year and a half ago. Mm-hmm. Did you think those changes were, quote unquote, good for business?
It's hard to say because the effects take a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to impact business in a negative way, which the previous government has done, and to reverse that and improve things, it takes at least a full term, if not two terms of a government. So we see some of the things that we agree with. We lobby the government. We talk to the previous government. We talk to this government. And we try to make improvements that improve the health of business. The reason we're the concerned manufacturers is that in the last 15 years, private sector employment as a percentage of population has dropped from 42% down to 34%. And those are the people who pay the tax that pay for everything else.
Sure. It's fair to say, though, that you prefer the current rules as opposed to the way it used to be under the Liberals?
As it relates to sick days?
Yeah.
It's a small thing compared to all of the other policies that were implemented in the past. The minimum wage, the initiative to make Ontario green with their failed energy plan that's driven a lot of businesses out of the country, including the one that I have. And we just look around us and think, how do we survive as small businesses? 92% of everyone employed in the private sector is employed by a company with 100 employees or less. And it's us that carry the burden to provide the tax money to fund everything. So when you have a lengthy period of government that has borrowed its way to a massive amount of debt, and then you ask this government to fix this overnight, I feel sorry for them.
Okay, let's go to Sarah. Sarah, what's involved in designing a company's sick policies to begin with?
Mm-hmm. So sick policies, they're not a standalone, so they're in conjunction with other policies that a company makes. And when I'm working with my clients, we start with the values or the pillars of the company in order to then integrate into the policies. So when we look at a sick day policy, we're looking at how it affects or how it comes from the values of the company. And if the values, or one of the main values, is the health and wellness or something like that for employees, then we'll often see that if we want to action that we would have a strong sick day policy, which may include and often includes paid sick days.
What if a company says, we love our employees, but as Peter says, it's competitive out there. We need to, find every nickel we can, and sorry, we just can't give everybody paid sick days off.
And that is the case oftentimes, especially when we're looking at environments and industries that there always needs to be a replacement for somebody who's out of the business. So looking at industries such as, daycare, security workers, food service, hospitality, when there is somebody out, there needs to be a replacement in most cases. So there is a cost to the company. However, when you have an employee coming in sick, there's also a cost to the company
There's a cost
as well.
of that too. Brian, can I, just before you jump in, let me get Brian in on this and ask him, sick days used to mean one thing once upon a time, okay? And now here we are in the year 2020, and it can include things like mental illness as well.
Sure.
How does that complicate our understanding of what a sick day is?
Well, I personally think that the question of paid sick days and leave entitlements is a very complex one that touches many aspects of our current reality. We often contemplate sick days in the context of having the flu or having a common cold, but as we all know, we're much more cognizant of mental health. I think the fourth industrial revolution and the prevalence of technology across every aspect of our lives has done a lot to increase stress levels. We are all, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, heavily interwoven with technology. We have phones with us every day, dealing with work issues at all times of the day, which can be very stressful. And I think the reality of our everyday lives has changed significantly over the last several decades. We have both parents working in most homes with busy jobs, trying to accommodate children's schedules. And all of these things, I think, come together to increase our collective stress levels. And that of course, makes our everyday lives a little bit harder.
Is that to suggest that you think companies need to take a broader view of what constitutes a sick day and have policies that reflect that?
Certainly, I think we have to take workers' best interest and health into consideration, but I would qualify that comment by also recognizing that, or saying that we need to recognize the impact that absenteeism has on businesses, especially small businesses, where, as my friend mentioned a moment ago, 98% of businesses in Canada have less than 100 employees, and at that scale...
Is it 90? 92. 92.
92, okay. Yeah, I was looking at the latest StatsCan report this morning, so if my numbers are a bit off. But my point being that at that scale, the division of labor doesn't kick in the same way it might at a larger organization, and people multitask more in the absence of an individual can have a much more profound effect on your operations on a day-to-day basis.
For sure. Kate, you wanted to say.
Yeah, I wanted to add, when we talk about people being absent from work and in these small businesses, as Sarah mentioned, a lot of these are public-facing industries. So daycare workers, they're people serving your food, they're people who are working oftentimes as PSWs in nursing homes. They're folks who they're not making this decision because they don't care about the health of the public. They're making the decision because they simply cannot afford to stay home when they're sick. And that impacts their health, but it has a tremendous impact on public health, and we really have to think about that cost.
You know, that's a good point, Kate. When I was thinking about what it would look like for someone to make the decision to stay home from work for an unpaid day, we're looking at if someone is at a $14 an hour, which is minimum wage, which is a lot of the people that we're discussing right now, and they're working for an 8-hour day. When that comes out to $112 a day, we're looking at, half of the grocery bill for that week for that family of 4. So that's a choice that people are having to make, when it impacts the family at that point, you will often see people making the choice to choose their family and go to work, and then that work suffers. And then, while we're looking at the cost of someone being absent, we're also looking at the cost of a compromised service or product and the impact of that as well.
Do you know, are there other provinces in the country that offer paid sick days?
There are, and it's something that has been varying as well. When this was introduced in Ontario, it was something that with 2 sick days was still quite a limited number. when we're looking at the whole year and overall. But when we look at, when we look at some companies when they're offering 3 or 5, it feels like a more healthy number. And what I would also suggest too is that while the number we're looking at paid sick time off, the sick day alone is not enough to talk about people being away from work. We're also looking at having that managed with the communication and the connection with the employer-employee, so that we're not talking about absenteeism and we're not talking about people abusing it, but we're actually talking about people being away when they're sick.
Peter, let me give you the first crack at this. I want to read out a few numbers here. This is according to an Ipsos poll conducted in 2018 on behalf of the Canadian Medical Association, and they found that 82% of employed Canadians would go to work sick if their employer required sick notes for minor illnesses, and 70% opposed the Ontario government's proposal to reinstate an employer's ability to require sick notes. You want to react to that?
I have to say that as an employer, particularly in manufacturing and industry, we don't have minimum wage workers. We have a difficult time finding workers. There is a shortage of skilled people. So what we're trying to accomplish here is to create an environment that brings better jobs to the country. And if you're being paid $30 an hour and you miss a day, it's not so difficult, as Sarah mentioned, a $14 an hour person. But we're driving those jobs away. And when people are in favor of adding adding a bit more burden to the employer, by itself it's not an issue. But when you take someone who was paying their employees $11.50 an hour, now they have to pay $14. It can put them out of business. But then, in my case, our lowest wage was $18 an hour. But then we had to jump up.
For what business?
In plastics manufacturing.
Got it.
So we had to jump up, and everybody had to jump up, and this contributes to inflation. I have to say that I'm so concerned about this. I got a notice in the mail yesterday from Deloitte that one of my customers is going bankrupt. This is a company in Brampton who had many suppliers, many of whom are friends of mine. Their unsecured debt is $14.5 million, and that's going to go through our industry. And it's going to cause, at least, from what I can see from the listing, at least another 10 bankruptcies.
Because lots of people are not going to get paid.
Because they just can't afford to do business here, and a big part of it is a hydro component. The hydro bills that we had before moving were 4 times of the jurisdiction we're in now, and nobody can afford this. One of our members is now paying 28 cents a kilowatt for furnaces they use to coat for the oil and gas industry. So we can't just keep pushing this burden down. There has to be other ways to improve health. We have to work together with our employees.
Well, let me ask
so
you about another
when an
burden.
employee comes to work sick, I don't let them in the door. I tell them to go home. And if they're a salaried employee, they just make up the time at another
Okay, but
time.
tell me this: if the law now requires that you're supposed to ask your employee for a doctor's note in order to have that day off, what do you think about the burden of
It's what I just said about the cooperation between the employer and the employee. I don't need a doctor's note to know that person is sick. They call me on the phone, I can tell they're sick, right? But if you have the situation where a government uses two days off as virtual vacation days that everybody took, by the way, when that was it legislated, by the time the Super Bowl happened, everybody took those 2 days. Particularly right after the Super Bowl. And they were vacation days. They didn't have to prove they were sick. Let's just take the 2 days off. Now, does 2 days really make a difference? If you're sick, you're not sick for 2 days. If you have the flu or something, you're out for a week, 2 weeks, or excuse me, worse.
I have to say, as someone who's working in the emergency department, the first thing is on the sick notes piece. I mean, you said it yourself. When the employee calls to tell you that they're sick, you know they're sick. You don't need that note. So
But I don't need the government to tell me.
Why is the government then forcing people to go to waiting rooms, to go to doctor's offices, to go to the emergency department, just to get a note that says they're sick?
you don't want to ask for him, and he doesn't want to ask for him either.
No, the reason that people are going to go to work instead of getting a sick note is, so you have to pay for transit or parking, then you have to sit in a waiting room for several hours. You could potentially infect other people. Then you see the doctor, then you got to get home. Well, now you spent hours of your day instead of resting. You've lost income. It's cost you money. You might have had to pay for the note. You may as well just go to work, which is bad for everyone.
But the point is, if the government isn't forcing those 2 sick days on the employer, there's no need for a note. If an employee comes to you and says they're sick, you're not going to. It's a cooperation between the government has to let us manage our own businesses and our own employees. We value our employees. They're like family to us.
Yes.
So we're concerned about their health. We're concerned about their time off and their compensation. We have to retain these employees, otherwise they'll go somewhere else.
Sarah, you
And
wanted to say.
that's exactly what we're hoping that a lot of companies will actually take a view and a stance on this, is looking at employees as part of the business and the family, and you take care of your business, you take care of your family in order to drive it forward from a business sense. And when there's something not right, then we're hoping that employers would look at it to say, go and rest, and not to the expense of you or your family, that you're getting taking a moment to get better, but that you're going to go and get refreshed and then come back to the workplace. So when looking at that, that is actually part of the strategy. And when companies do have a health and wellness focus, then this is one of those actionables that can demonstrate that they are living their commitment, which is allowing people to have those 2 days or X amount of days to actually get better.
Ryan, you wanted to say.
Yeah, I just want to clarify a point, and I know this is a very touchy subject. The Internal Employment Standards Act doesn't actually require that an employer demand a medical note. It's an option, and it doesn't force employees to take sick days if they don't need them. The reality is that people will use them over the course of a year, or they'll attempt to use them over the course of the year for various reasons. They're sick, but under the previous Bill 148 wording, you had those additional days, which were personal days. And we all know, and I'm not saying every employee is not worthy of trust, but there are instances where people have personal days.
There's some fudging going on, is what you're trying to say
It will
nicely.
happen. My friend mentioned a moment ago, days like the Super Bowl, long weekends come, you start to see absences creep in on the Friday, the Monday to bookend the weekend. And I'm not opposed to having sick days provided for under legislation, but I do agree with there being some level of accountability within your workforce.
And that's what I was, you're causing me to think about is, it's not a sick day policy issue when there's someone who's abusing the sick days that are allotted from the company, but it's an employee issue and perhaps an engagement issue. If someone is disengaged or not engaged, then yeah, they will take those days and they will abuse them, but that's not a sick day policy issue.
That's an ethics issue.
That's an ethics issue.
But
That's an
Kate, you
employee
wanted to
issue.
say.
I wanted to say, we're talking about under Bill 148, 10 days of job-protected
Just to
personal
explain,
emergency
Bill
leave.
148 was the old liberal
The old liberal
law.
policy, yeah. And so these were unpaid job-protected days with the exception of the first 2 days. And I want to give you an example of what this looks like.
That's
So
true.
I had a patient who was sick. He had a really bad cold. A couple days, he missed work. This was in the fall. So he'd used his 2 paid days. This was after the change. So he'd used 2 of his 3 personal emergency leave days, because now you only have 3 personal emergency leave days for sickness. And he had chest pain, and my recommendation to him was, we need to organize follow-up for you to see a cardiologist. And he said, I've used my days. Like 3 days are so little. There's so little even for one illness, like influenza, where we tell people to stay home for 24 hours after their fever has gone away. And emergencies happen to people. I absolutely know that, working in the emergency department. And we need legislation that protects people when emergencies arise. We need it to be flexible. It has to protect all workers. And that's the other piece. We can talk about, employment cultures in companies, but this isn't going to protect public health if it's not protecting everyone, which means that those low-wage workers who are the most precariously employed need a law that protects them.
I've got some numbers here I want to share. This is, now admittedly, this is, it's a bit old data, but new numbers are apparently hard to come by on this stuff. This is from a 2013 report by the Conference Board of Canada looking into absenteeism trends in Canadian organizations. Sheldon, why don't you bring this up? Thank you, and I'll read it out for those listening on podcast. The average absenteeism rate in the year 2011 was 9.3 days per full-time employee, 9.3 days. The estimated direct cost of absenteeism to the Canadian economy was north of $16 billion. That's 8 years ago. $16 billion a year. And less than half of Canadian organizations currently track employee absences. Let's find out about this. Peter, how big a problem is absenteeism to the business community?
It's always something that you plan for. You bring in temporary people to make a replacement. I wanted to give you an example of my bookkeeper. She came to me 3 years ago and said that her doctor said, I need to take 3 months off of work. She had digestive issues and she had to be calmed down for that time. I had to find a replacement for her, but I knew that if I didn't pay her continually for that time that she was off, I would have lost her. And that's a person who has knowledge about my company, knowledge about how the books are done, and I can't afford to lose that person. So it's my decision to work with her. You know, she took all her vacation days, but then another two months beyond that, we continued to pay her.
Her regular full salary?
Her regular full salary, because I needed her to come back. And if a company is to value its employees, which we do, we have to make those exceptions. But for the government, can you imagine if the government came in and told me I had to pay her that?
Well, the government's not
during that time.
that, though,
But
right?
their policies, one after another, that they implement simply to get elected by handing out free things that there is no money to pay for, eventually becomes a huge negative for businesses.
Go ahead,
I
Sarah.
think you're describing, a situation where an employer is taking care of his employee and, seeing the need of being able to take care through paying those sick days. So that's an example of, where we all want to head to, and we're hoping that we all have employers like this. And the government is instilling a minimum. So this is a minimum of the policies through the employment standards that, allows for people who don't know where to start, or maybe aren't as generous, or don't know the impact of having a policy like this will have positively on their employee work base. That's why the government needs to have something like a sick day policy with paid sick days, not to burden the businesses.
Ryan, let me ask you this. One of the reasons we're talking about this right now, obviously, is that the coronavirus has got people, wondering, am I allowed to take a sick day if I feel something coming on? What's my obligation? What's the employer's obligation? What's my obligation to the public health status of the province of Ontario? How has the coronavirus crisis affected all of this?
I think it's obviously a very concerning development. But if there's something positive to be gleaned from it, I think it's forcing a lot of businesses, particularly small businesses, to edify themselves on illness management and potentially disease management. And this type of issue really touches on every aspect of human resource management from health and safety. So under the Health and Safety Act, every employer has a statutory duty to take reasonable cautions to protect the workers, and workers have a corresponding right to refuse unsafe work. So for instance, if somebody were infected in the workplace, then there was a reasonable risk of harm to the other employees. You'd have to take measures to deal with that. Every business has to have a health and safety, 5 employees or more has to have at least a health and safety representative. Touches upon what we've been talking about earlier about absence management, but also accommodation. If someone becomes debilitated by a virus or a disease and is unable to do their job, it could trigger a duty to accommodate. And a lot of smaller businesses who haven't encountered a potentially catastrophic, I'm exaggerating a little bit because I know there's a report this morning that we're still at low risk, but a type of situation that could sink your workforce really causes you to evaluate and coordinate your strategy and your policies to be able to deal with this, so you're managing your productivity while also taking care of your staff and complying with your legal obligations. Is a tricky one.
Let me follow up with Kate, because Ryan's right. We've thankfully not had a huge outbreak here. We've had thankfully very few cases of coronavirus in the province of Ontario. But you have to consider the big picture. What are the consequences to public health if people come into work sick?
I think your guest said it very well last week on the show, actually, that one of the important things is that if people start getting sick, they need to be able to stay home. And they're only going to be able to stay home if they're paid for that time. And that was one of the learnings from when they looked back at SARS. there's actually pretty good data from the H1N1 epidemic in 2009, where they looked at the impact of workplace policy on workplace attendance for people with flu. And in the States, they found that there were millions of additional cases that were attributable to workplace spread that was preventable with workplace policies such as paid sick leave. So in other contexts, and I'm not saying that coronavirus and pandemic influenza necessarily behave in exactly the same way, but we know that workplace spread is a major contributor, and it's important that people can stay home from the first day of their illness. When people don't have access to paid sick leave, or when they only have 3 days of job-protected emergency leave, people parse those days out. They tell us all the time, they kind of do the math, right? You go to work the first day, and then the second day and you get sicker, and then the third day, maybe now you're really too sick, and then you're gonna stay home. You've already infected other people in your workplace. We need a policy that protects people in a much more comprehensive way than that.
Do you have a policy at your workplace on this?
Yes, we do. But I just wanted to make a point that when you're worried about transmission of viruses, and you're much more educated on this than I am, isn't the transmission before the symptoms occur? Right? Isn't that how the spread happens? So if by the time somebody is sick and doesn't show up for work, they've already infected everybody else at work. So I don't get that connection. If you're worried about public health, and your business has done such a great job in passing on information, every one of these outbreaks that comes is not as bad as the previous one because of what you've learned and how you treat it. And you deserve all the credit in the world for that. If you go back to the worst flu ever after the First World War, killing 1 in 60 people on the planet, to the swine flu, to H1N1, to SARS, and now Corona. And I don't know what's going to happen with the coronavirus, but I would imagine that you'll handle that better than all the ones before too. So I don't know how the sick day thing is related to this.
So just to clarify, I mean, with the coronavirus, I don't know the most up-to-date evidence about how long people are infectious before they're symptomatic. We do know that people who are symptomatic are contagious. We also know that many people have relatively mild symptoms. So people who are coughing and sneezing and spreading a virus like the flu virus by droplets are definitely at risk of infecting other people. So, and many of those people are going to go to work when they're sick if they don't have paid sick days. Is that necessarily going to capture 100% of the potential for contagion to others? I can't speak to that. I don't know the specifics of coronavirus well enough. But I can say it's a huge step forward compared with the current situation, which is you might have a personal support worker going into a nursing home while sick because he or she simply cannot afford not to.
Is it an option, Sarah, let me ask you this, is it an option for people who are sick, and who knows, maybe they're not sure what they've got, but if they feel sick, is it an option for the boss to come to them and say, look, you're sick, and I know our policy and provincial law right now says I don't have to pay you, but you got to go home, and you just got to take one for the team because I can't have you infecting everybody else here. Sorry.
If an employer is sending an employee home, then typically, and there's a lot of variables in that case, but yeah, typically the employer will pay for that employee to be sent home. Now, that's a good thing, but to take one for the team. But I think
you're not taking one for the team if you're getting paid. You're taking one for the team if you're not getting paid. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yes, I understand what you're saying, but you're also away from work. And one of the things about not being at work is not just about you being better, but there is a stress to make sure that your work is covered, that lesson plans are prepared, that you have coverage, knowing that there's stress on your colleagues who you're a team with. So there is effects that are beyond the actual staying at home and getting better that do add a stress to the employee as well.
Does anybody have a sense of what the sweet spot is on this? Okay, if you didn't like it the way it was, if business didn't like it the way it was under the Liberals, because it was too generous and you thought business couldn't be competitive and afford it, and if you think right now it's too miserly under the Progressive Conservatives, where's the sweet spot? Let's get into some discussion about this. Ryan, start us off.
Well, I think looking to the government to seal this issue through provisions in the ESA is probably a little...
Employment Standards Act?
Employment Standards Act, pardon me, is a little bit ambitious because government can't possibly, I don't think, pass legislation that is going to cover every conceivable sector, environment, scenario. Where I really think this discussion goes is into an examination into an awareness of employee-employer relations through organizations like ours and my colleagues. It's about causing employers to look inward and decide what works for their business in their industry. And in every sector, in every environment, there's going to be horse trading. And as an organization, you have to find your sweet spot, I think. And I really think it's employer-specific and industry-specific. So the legislation gives you the floor below which you cannot go. But beyond that, I think it's a matter of employee-employer relations that's managed through your business, through your advisors, through your philosophy, and through your vision.
Kate, I think it's unlikely that the current government is going to reinstate the old Liberal plan, which they have already repealed. So how could they bevel the edges of what they're doing right now to satisfy you?
Well, I think, and let's be honest, the Liberal plan with 2 paid sick days, I think we've all alluded to the fact that a lot of illness lasts longer than 2 days. So just to be clear, we were actually asking for 7 paid sick days because that's how long things like the flu oftentimes last.
Yes, over the course of a full year, I presume.
That's correct, over the course of a full year. Things that we're asking the government to do, those 10 days of job-protected personal emergency leave, reinstating that would mean people at the very least don't have to worry about the threat of losing their job. Making sure that people don't require sick notes. You know, we talk about sort of employer and spending money and public health money like they're coming out of completely different pots. The government is paying for public health. Taxpayers are paying for public health. It's important that we have policies, labor policies, that also impact health in a positive way. And so it's really important that we, for example, no longer allow employers to ask for sick notes. I think reinstating those 2 days, you know, whether the government is likely to do it urgently or not, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict what they're going to do. But I do know this piece about making sure the floor is high enough that everyone is protected is so critical. And we can't rely solely on employer-employee relationships because they don't protect the most vulnerable workers, which puts everyone in the province at risk.
Peter, I know you don't think the current situation is too miserly, but there is some opinion at this table that it is. So
I don't.
how could you
think
bevel
so.
your edges in order to
I like
find a
what
compromise?
Katie said about protecting the person's job. I 100% agree with that. Nobody should be in fear of losing their job because they're off sick. And I think if that's the case, I would agree 100%. The thing is that since the government has changed to the current government, they've increased healthcare spending by $1.6 billion. They've increased education by $1.4 billion. They're actually spending more money, and yet everybody's crying that they're cutting everything. So I don't that is perpetuated by some of the media, which I think is an unfair.
I'll give you the argument. I'm not taking a position on it. I'll give you the argument. The argument is, yes, they're increasing spending, but not as much as inflation and not taking demographic effects into account.
Because they have to do something about the debt. But so they're not pulling back, but nobody else is getting inflation either. And inflation is now going to start going out of control after we look at what's happening with these blockades and people not being able to supply their businesses, and the cost of groceries going up, and the cost of fuel going up, and carbon tax, and everything else that's compounded on us. There's just not enough money. And as I said, I feel sorry for this government having to pull back and look for efficiencies just for us to survive as taxpayers. And let's be clear, the government is us. They're our employees. It's our money they're using to do these things. So I would agree with protecting jobs. I would agree with doing something to improve transmission of disease. I mean, should we be going into schools and teaching the little snot monsters that are there that they should wash their hands and not touch their eyes and nose when there are flus going around, right? So I mean, is there other ways to make improvements to the healthcare and the health of the province without further burdening the taxpayers?
On that note, you get the last word, and on behalf of snot monsters everywhere, we're going to call this one to end. Kate Hayman, Ryan Wozniak, Peter Gossman, Sarah Yurachuk, all good of all of you to come into TVO tonight and have this discussion with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.